Today, from Washington, Donald Trump read a teleprompter speech to the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland. And I make the point about the teleprompter because it means that the things that Donald Trump said that are completely untrue were fully premeditated lies. It's one thing to misstate something when you're speaking extemporaneously. We've all done that. But to have staff type a lie into a teleprompter that you can then tell to listeners in Switzerland, all of whom know it's a lie, is the kind of unique choice that in the history of the American presidency has been made only by Donald Trump. He also made choices in that teleprompter speech that weren't lies, but were things that no other president would say, like this.
I'll demand that interest rates drop immediately, and likewise, they should be dropping all over the world. Interest rates should follow us.
The Federal Reserve Board sets interest rates in this country. Other countries set interest rates through similarly structured independent financial arms of their governments. It has never been within the powers of the President of the United States to set interest rates. And because the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 as an independent body, presidents have refrained from telling the Federal Reserve what to do with interest rates, even when they wish they could. But Donald Trump is trying to trample on the independence of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Chair, Republican Jerome Powell, who was first appointed by Donald Trump and then reappointed by Joe Biden to another 5-year term, doesn't sound afraid of Donald Trump.
If he asked you to leave, would you go?
No.
Do you think that legally you're not required to leave?
No.
Do you believe the president has the power to fire or demote you, and has the Fed determined the legality of a president demoting at will any of the other governors with leadership positions?
Not permitted under the law.
And so Donald Trump, who likes to flaunt his power, didn't realize that he was flaunting his powerlessness with Jerome Powell today. The lie Donald Trump told to the World Economic Forum today is a lie he has told just about every day of his political career. It's one thing to tell a lie to people who don't know it's a lie, like Trump supporters at a Trump rally. It's another thing, it is indeed pathological, to tell a lie directly to people who all know it's a lie. You're going to recognize this lie when you hear it. You've heard it before. Here's today's version.
If you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay down debt.
No, you won't. You won't have to pay a tariff. Everyone at the World Economic Forum knows who pays the tariffs, and they all know it's not them. The only people who pay the Trump tariffs, which do indeed end up in the United States Treasury, are the only people who can contribute to the United States Treasury, the people of the United States of America. If Donald Trump puts a tariff on televisions made in China or South Korea, when they arrive at the port of entry of this country, that tariff is not paid by anyone in China or any foreign country. That tariff will be paid literally at the dock by the person or company in the United States who wants that TV. So basically, the way it works is someone from Best Buy is at the dock at the Port of Los Angeles or wherever the TVs come in whatever container ship they come in on. And when those goods come into this country, when the big shipment of TVs made in Asia arrives for Best Buy, Best Buy's person is right there paying the tariff. In this case, it's say a Trump 50% tariff right at the dock, and that tariff is paid by Best Buy directly to the same person who's been at that dock since the start of this country, a customs agent. A customs agent right there at the dock, collecting the money from the American standing there at the dock, who's paying him that money called a tariff. And that customs agent, in effect, then sends that money to the United States Treasury. And the TV that Best Buy was going to sell for $1,000 now costs $1,500 because Best Buy has to make up the money that it just paid for the 50% tariff at the port of entry. When you buy the TV, you'll never see the tariff built into the price of it. You'll just see the $1,500. But if Donald Trump imposes the kind of tariff he's threatening to impose, you will see the prices of televisions at Best Buy go up by at least 50%. Donald Trump's choice of Treasury Secretary said in his confirmation hearing that he doesn't expect the price of imported televisions to go up 50% because he expects the television manufacturers in Asia to cut their prices by 50% so that you'll continue to buy their TVs at the same price. A TV manufacturer might be able to do that for a very short period of time if the tariff were, say, 5% or less. So it could be on a very low tariff for a very short time that a foreign manufacturer would lower the price so that the product that you buy, you wouldn't experience the price increase, but the money paid for that tariff would still be paid by that same person, that same American importer at the dock, which is to say, by Americans. The Americans who imported those TVs would pay those tariffs. No foreign country has ever paid 1 penny of tariffs to the United States in the history of tariffs. A tariff is taking money, a Trump tariff is taking money from Americans in exactly the same way that a tax is taking money from Americans. And Donald Trump doesn't want you to know that his tariffs take money from you. And so it is his most enduring and most repeated lie. Actually, the correct way for Donald Trump to say what he was trying to say today would be, if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply the American people will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff, which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury to strengthen our economy and pay our debt. Of course, he's wildly overestimating how much money you can raise from tariffs, which is why no country in the world tries to rely on tariffs to finance their government. The American people alone pay Trump tariffs. No one else on the planet, no one in China will ever pay a Trump tariff. We patiently await the White House press corps confronting Donald Trump about his perpetual lie about tariffs, something they have never done.
Donald Trump today hit with his first loss in court of his second term. Comes just 3 days after being sworn in, and it's connected to a central issue, immigration. In a blistering ruling, a federal judge in Seattle halted Donald Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship, the right that is enshrined in the Constitution that grants automatic citizenship to children who are born on American soil. The judge in the case, a Ronald Reagan appointee, called Trump's order, quote, blatantly unconstitutional and added, quote, I've been on the bench for over 4 decades. I can't remember another case where the question presented is as clear as this one, end quote. The judge scolded the Trump DOJ lawyer arguing this case, quote, frankly, I have difficulty understanding how a member of the bar could state unequivocally that this is a constitutional order. It just boggles my mind. The judge issuing his ruling from the bench after only 25 minutes of arguments. It stops Donald Trump's order from taking effect for 14 days, giving the Trump DOJ time to respond. Now, Trump came into office vowing a radical change to the country's immigration system, from sweeping raids and crackdowns to rewriting the Constitution. And on day 3, he's hitting his first setback. Joining our conversation now, Christy Greenberg, former federal prosecutor, SDNY Criminal Division, and Deputy Chief of the SDNY Criminal Division, and MSNBC legal analyst, as well as Howard Dean, former DNC chair and the former governor of Vermont. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Christy, let me start with you. I've got my pocket Constitution. You know me well. I don't know that much about the law, but I read it, and it's a relatively clear 14th Amendment that states what this case is. Talk to me about the legality of this. There were a lot of people who were asking on Monday, can he even do this?
No, he can't. And the judge actually was very clear that he can't. I mean, this is a really fundamental principle of citizenship by birth within the United States. This is clear. The terms in the Constitution are explicit. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And there is history dating back to 1898. The United States Supreme Court looked at this very question and deemed that the 14th Amendment, as applied to children born of resident aliens, are citizens. So, and then you also have congressional law that defines nationals and citizens of U.S. at birth to include people born in the United States. So this is very, very clear. And then so the question is, if the law is clear, as the judge said, he was, shocked that that a lawyer would even get up in court and argue that this was constitutional when it's so clearly not. The question then becomes, well, what's going on here? And I think there are really two things that are going on. One, you have an attempt at a power grab. We know that the Supreme Court has an expansive vision of presidential power from the presidential immunity opinion. And so this is their opening shot to see how far they can push the judiciary to really expand presidential power. That's one. But I think the second is really more what's going on, which is really they're trying to control the narrative. This isn't really about the law at all. This is really about controlling the narrative on immigration, creating this us versus them mentality so that we can talk about immigrants coming to this country illegally to have children and the rest of us having to then pay for those children, creating this climate of fear and anger and stoking that. And I think in that conversation, there's a fear for the judiciary, a fear for undocumented persons, and a fear for the people who are defending them. So I think those are really the two things that are animating Trump's move here.
Howard, good to see you again, by the way. Let's talk about this. This is not it's not a slam dunk. There are a bunch of executive orders that Donald Trump signed that can take some effect and that can have effect almost immediately. This isn't one of them. So there's a bit of a surprise as to why, given every likelihood that what happened today was going to happen. Some judge was going to say, I don't know if you've read your Constitution lately, you can't do this.
Well, the thing that worries me is you've got a Supreme Court that's basically a right-wing, partisan, and in some cases corrupt Supreme Court, which is business, which they've made their reputation rubber stamping stuff like of this kind that Trump has done, and then saying it was okay and it was constitutional. So while this judge, a Reagan appointee, as you pointed out, it seems to be upholding the law, there's no guarantee that's going to happen as it works its way up the court system. So I'd be interested in what Christie has to say about this, because I'm deeply worried about what the Supreme Court is going to do. They just make stuff up and they think nothing about doing it, and they've done it again and again and again.
So, Christie, let's examine this. Both of you have suggested that the goal here, and I think both of the stories that you suggested, one is that there's an anti-immigrant narrative there, but let's talk about the other one, the idea that this goes up the legal chain. There is a part of this constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, that, as you said, has been tried and tested before the Supreme Court to demonstrate that it's actually about people born in the United States, regardless of whether their parents were citizens, or a continuation of the 13th Amendment, which didn't grant people citizenship because they were enslaved. In this amendment, it talks about being subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof and are citizens of the United States. What does that mean, and why are some people saying that's the rub for the Trump case?
Yeah, so Trump is and his DOJ are trying to argue that the 14th Amendment excludes children born of parents who are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, meaning people who are unlawfully in the United States. And I think rightfully the judge asked, well, what does that mean? Of course, even if somebody is not here legally, they're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Aren't they subject to United States laws? Couldn't you prosecute them? And the lawyer for the DOJ said, well, they're subject to our laws, and yes, of course we could prosecute them. So I think it's a really strained argument to try to use this phrase to really try to create exceptions. I don't think it would work. There are some exceptions to the 14th Amendment. For example, children of foreign diplomats are not considered, that is considered an exception.
But that's an important distinction, right, Christie? Because foreign diplomats are not, I'm an immigrant immigrant to this country, I am subject to all the same laws that the two of you are. But as a diplomat, I'm actually not. So that's an actual real exemption. Doesn't apply to most people, right?
Does not apply to most people. And what you're going to see Trump's DOJ try to do is really try to widen that net of exceptions that apply. And as the judge pointed out in the hearing today, it's a really strained argument because, as you point out, the laws do apply to most people in the United States. Diplomats are a very, unique and specific, narrow example.
Howard, one of the things that this has served to do is, and I wouldn't have guessed that this would be the first thing to do this, but it's created it's coalesced opposition to Trump in the form of 18 states that have filed suit against this, including one attorney general in Connecticut who is himself a beneficiary of birthright citizenship. I wouldn't have thought this is the one that was going to cause people to say, hold on, we can actually stand up to some of this nonsense, but that is happening.
Well, I think I would disagree. This is not his first one. His first one was pardoning essentially cop killers, which even the Fraternal Order of Police, which endorsed him, has a problem with that. So I'm not sure what his game is. Maybe his game often is, I'll do something outrageous so you'll forget about the outrageous thing I did the day before. That's how the Greenland annexation, I think, came about, was trying to divert attention from the fact that he was about to be sentenced as a convicted felon in New York, which he now has been. So who knows what game he's playing and what he's trying to do. But his MO is just to throw as much street stuff at the wall as possible and see what sticks. And I think that's what's going on here.
Christy, let's discuss. There's the appellate route we discussed, and then there's this other thing, the lawsuits by the states. Is that a different process? Is that a number of state lawsuits? How does that work? And how might these states and their governors and attorneys general push back against this attempt?
Right. So you have a number of different states that are looking at this all around the country. I believe there's another lawsuit going on in Massachusetts. But this injunction right now is a temporary restraining order, which can, again, temporarily block the executive order from taking effect. But in 2 weeks, they come back February 6th, and the judge will determine after a hearing whether or not this is a preliminary injunction. And again, the question is this nationwide, or is this cabin to the states that bring it? And you heard Trump's DOJ really pushing here for this not to be taken into effect nationwide, for this to be very specific to the states who brought it. But that really doesn't make sense. If one person travels from one state to another, it shouldn't affect what their citizenship is. So I think we can expect, even as these state AGs bring these lawsuits around the country, you're really going to then see a nationwide ban in effect. It would just be too hard to implement otherwise, which ultimately means that we're going to get the showdown in the Supreme Court if these states decide, differently from one another about whether there should be this ban in the first place.
The kind of drunk that you take work folks to a strip club, and so drunk then that you try to get up on stage and dance with the strippers. The kind of drunk that stopped the Uber because you're going to vomit drunk. Look, I understand there are people who have alcohol problems, but we cannot trust the safety of our country to someone who has demonstrated repeatedly using very bad judgment with alcohol and doing it in ways that truly have incapacitated him.
Senator Elizabeth Warren at her most memorable last night here on this show, speaking on the subject of Pete Hegseth. Mr. Hegseth is the co-host of a weekend morning show on Fox News, and now the nominee to be Defense Secretary in the Trump administration. Despite concerns like the ones expressed by Senator Warren and other Democrats on the Armed Services Committee, Pete Hegseth's nomination advanced today in the Senate largely along party lines. There were two Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who joined all Democrats in voting no against him today. That means if one more Republican joins the two of them in the final vote tomorrow, the vote on him will be tied, but he'd still get through because J.D. Vance, as vice president, would break the tie in Pete Hegseth's favor. If two more Republican senators said no, though, Mr. Hegseth's nomination would fail. Even as the Hegseth nomination has continued to move forward, so has the reporting that has Democrats and a few Republicans questioning whether he is an okay pick to oversee the entire U.S. military. Mr. Hegseth has been dogged by a long list of allegations, each of which he has denied. He denies allegations of excessive drinking, including by work colleagues who said he was frequently drunk, sometimes very drunk, at work functions, and that he had alcohol on his breath, even at his morning show job. He denies alleged mismanagement of 2 nonprofits for veterans. He denies an allegation of sexual assault in a 2017 case where prosecutors didn't press charges, but where Mr. Hegseth did reach an agreement with the woman who had gone to police. The agreement included a payment to her that she should be quiet about it. Today, we learned how much he paid. Answering a written question from Senator Warren, Pete Hegseth said that he paid this woman $50,000 for her silence. But new questions this week about Hegseth began with a story first reported by NBC News. Here's the headline, quote, "Senators receive affidavit containing new allegations against Pete Hegseth, who denies the claims." The sworn affidavit comes from his former sister-in-law, a woman who was married to his brother. She submitted the affidavit at the request of the top Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee. NBC News reporting, quote, "Danielle Hegseth described in the affidavit allegations of volatile and threatening conduct by Hegseth that made his second wife, Samantha, fear for her safety." In the affidavit, the former sister-in-law details instances in which she says she was, quote, "a witness to and even a victim of emotional abuse by Pete Hegseth." She says she personally witnessed him abusing alcohol numerous times. That reporting is what Warren was responding to so memorably last night. An attorney for Hegseth denied the story, telling NBC News that Hegseth's ex-wife, quote, "has never alleged that there was any abuse. She signed court documents acknowledging there was no abuse. She recently reaffirmed the same during her FBI interview." The ex-wife herself told NBC, "There was no physical abuse in my marriage. And, quote, I have not and will not comment on my marriage to Pete Hegseth." For the record, NBC reports that she gave the FBI a prepared statement that said Hegseth has had and continues to have a problem with alcohol abuse. But the question of whether Hegseth's 2 ex-wives were able to publicly discuss details of their marriages to Pete Hegseth, that came up during his Senate hearing.
In finalizing divorces from your first and second wives, were there non-disclosure agreements in connection with those divorces?
Senator, not that I'm aware of.
If there were, would you agree to release those first and second wives from any confidentiality agreement?
Senator, it's not something I'm aware of.
But if there were, you would agree to release them from a confidentiality agreement?
Senator, that's not my responsibility.
Turns out that while this is not a full non-disclosure agreement, there is something in the divorce papers from Pete Hegseth's second marriage that is worth knowing about, given how his confirmation hearings have gone. Check this out. This is the divorce decree from 2018 in the Minnesota court system. MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin was able to obtain this today. You can see the decree contains a, quote, parenting plan setting out how the Hegseths would handle taking care of the kids after the divorce. Part of that plan includes, quote, avoiding derogatory comments. Quote, both parties agree to not say anything negative about the other parent to or in front of the children or allow third parties within their control to do so. In addition, both parties will refrain from engaging themselves in any public discourse, including through either traditional media or social media, disparaging the other party, and will take reasonable steps to encourage friends and family to refrain from doing so. And they both signed this document, Pete Hegseth and his second ex-wife, Samantha. Again, to be clear, this clause is not a full non-disclosure agreement. A lawyer for Mr. Hegseth, Tim Parlatore, tells MSNBC, quote, it is a limited non-disparagement agreement. These are 2 legally distinct concepts. There's nothing inappropriate or inaccurate about Mr. Hegseth's answers to the committee. It takes some significant imagination and intellectual dishonesty for anyone to consider this to bear on the credibility of his testimony. Both parties will refrain from engaging in any public discourse disparaging the other party. Senator Kaine provided a statement to MSNBC as well, saying, quote, that clause in a divorce settlement could expose someone to severe consequences for sharing unflattering information about an ex-partner, even if that information is true. The existence of this agreement, which has not been previously reported, seems important on the eve of Pete Hegseth's confirmation vote tomorrow in the United States Senate, one that seems to hinge on just one or two votes. Joining us now is Lisa Rubin, MSNBC legal correspondent. Lisa, it's good to see you. Thanks for your reporting on this. Can you describe the document that you found? Tell us how it fits into the broader picture of reporting on Hegseth.
Well, I think, Rachel, let's talk about, first, I want to clarify something. Yeah. This is not a full non-disparagement provision. In fact, it's a very broad non-disparagement provision. What it's not is a non-disclosure agreement in typical fashion. In terms of how this fits into the larger reporting about Hegseth, Hegseth has been dogged by all sorts of allegations about his past, which you recounted in your earlier segment, including ones related to his 2 marriages. The fact that Hegseth had denied that he had non-disclosure agreements might be technically correct, but we talk a lot about the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
Non-disclosure versus non-disparagement is the distinction.
That's correct. But functionally, even though this doesn't say either one of them can't say anything, functionally, this operates almost as if it were a non-disclosure agreement, because by agreeing not to engage in any, and this is the quote, public discourse that would disparage the other spouse, essentially, Samantha Hegseth has her hands tied. She is precluded legally from saying something that could be construed by Pete Hegseth and his legal representatives to be damaging to him. And as we know, Pete Hegseth and his lawyers have alleged multiple times to multiple people that the things they have said in the public are themselves defamatory, if not violations of other agreements that he has entered into with them.
And this matters in the confirmation process because of claims about his relationship with his ex-wives, particularly his second wife, that are things that raise questions about his character. For the
and I want to put this into context, particularly with respect to Samantha Hegseth's one and only public statement in regards to that affidavit submitted by her former sister-in-law. That's an affidavit in which Samantha Hegseth's former sister-in-law says that based on things that Samantha said to her, as well as things that she observed, she believes not only that Pete Hegseth has an alcohol abuse problem, but that he was abusive to Samantha. Samantha Hegseth's statement to NBC says there was no physical abuse during my marriage, but she doesn't deny any emotional abuse. She doesn't deny that she feared for her safety, which is another allegation that Danielle Hegseth makes in the affidavit. She doesn't deny even that she had a code word that she used with friends and family in case she ever needed an escape plan with respect to that fear of Pete Hegseth. All she is saying in her public statement is that there was no physical abuse. There is not a lot of contradiction between that statement and what Danielle Hegseth is saying. Danielle Hegseth has an allegation of one instance of sexual abuse, and she herself draws a distinction between physical and sexual abuse in her affidavit.
Briefly, have you heard anything from Capitol Hill tonight?
I have. I've heard from Senator Tim Kaine's office because Senator Kaine was asked what this means to him. He said not only can he understand this language as sort of a disincentive for someone to speak, but a spokesperson for the senator commented to me tonight when I asked them, do you think Hegseth was untruthful or misleading in his answers to the questions Senator Kaine asked him during his testimony? The response on the record attributable to a spokesperson for Senator Tim Kaine is yes, he does think that, Rachel.
That's important, given that his vote is slated for tomorrow. Lisa Rubin, MSNBC legal correspondent, thank you for this reporting. Thanks for helping us get it on the air. I know it was a bear to get it sorted tonight, but we've got every I dotted, every T crossed, and I really appreciate your work on this.
Thank you.
I'll be right back. Stay with us.
The Iranian regime will have to be dealt with by President Trump. I'm confident he will go back to a model which tries to get to a better outcome. A new sheriff in town, a new leader in just, goodness, under 4 weeks now will make an enormous amount of difference.
So that sound, that praise for Donald Trump, that's from 4 weeks ago, and it's from Mike Pompeo. You may remember him from Trump's first term. He was first the CIA director, then the Secretary of State. But my, what a difference 4 weeks makes. Pompeo, up until today, had been receiving briefings and had a security detail to protect him because of ongoing threats on his life from Iran because of his role in the Soleimani hit. That security detail was put in place by the Biden administration and stayed in place despite his praise for Trump and attacks on Biden. It has been revoked, though, by Donald Trump, the man he praised there in that clip. And on that, the New York Times reports this, quote, President Trump revoked security protection for his former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and a former top aide, Brian Hook, despite warnings from the Biden administration that both men faced ongoing threats from Iran because of actions they took on Trump's behalf. 4 people with knowledge of the matter said Thursday. The New York Times reports that the security details were pulled Tuesday, just a day after Trump's former national security advisor and critic, John Bolton. But Pompeo had remained publicly supportive of Trump. So the question is, why put his life in danger? Let's bring in former CIA director, now senior national security analyst John Brennan, and New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley. Michael Crowley, on the reporting, my understanding is that this group of former senior national security officials, including Donald Trump himself, but also his then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State at the time, John Bolton, was related to, or the intelligence stream at least related to, a pledge for retribution from Iran over the strike that killed Soleimani in Iraq. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's our understanding. I mean, after that strike, which was devastating for Iran, both in terms of costing them a critical military and strategic leader, but also completely humiliating. Following that, Iran did very little to retaliate. There was a strike against a U.S. military base that certainly did injure American soldiers who had concussions, but in relative terms, it was a pretty mild response. So I think the Iranians do not feel like they've had anything remotely like compensatory payback.
And so the protection that was afforded to Pompeo and Bolton by President Joe Biden was in relation to an assessment that they faced ongoing threats of retribution from Iran?
That's right. This is not a hypothetical speculative thing. This is the assessment of intelligence agencies. It's based on specific information, and it's not just people wringing their hands or coming up with vague scenarios. And briefly, Nicole, let me tell you, anecdotally, I can say that I was in a Washington restaurant a couple years ago when Mike Pompeo showed up. It looked like he was going to a private event in a private room in the restaurant. And I was gobsmacked by the size of his security detail. Again, he was a former Secretary of State at this point, and he had a retinue of people who looked like they were bodyguards and security men that was, if anything, larger than what you might expect a sitting Secretary of State to have. I mean, there were multiple big black Suburbans, a bunch of guys and women with the earpieces talking to each other just for him to go out to a restaurant. So this was, they were taking this very seriously, obviously.
And Soleimani's still dead, and Iran is still mad about that. So the threat ostensibly hasn't changed. So why does Trump strip the security detail from Pompeo, Hook, and Bolton, Michael Crowley?
Nicole, we don't know for sure, and like so many things with Donald Trump, it's very hard to know exactly what's going on in his head. And this one is a little bit complicated because these 3 men are all different figures. They are on different places. If you try to imagine a spectrum for Trump of where he sees them in terms of allies or foes, he has openly feuded with John Bolton for years, who has publicly denounced Trump, called him unfit for office, said he should not have been president. So, he clearly very much dislikes John Bolton. Mike Pompeo and he had a pretty good relationship when he was president. Pompeo wavered a little bit. I forget the details as I'm sitting here, but after January 6th and the 2020 election, Pompeo was not fully on board with Trump's claims of election fraud and was not among those who were defending the January 6th riot, as I recall. Brian Hook is the biggest mystery here. Brian, to my knowledge, has not spoken out, been critical of President Trump in any notable way. There's been a little bit of speculation that Brian, he went on TV and spoke a little bit about what he thought Trump's approach to Iran would be after the election, including saying he would adopt maximum pressure against Iran. And maybe he got a little far over his skis, but it's really not much to go on. So that's a big question mark.
As we keep a close eye on the new administration, one question we have been asking: is this White House for sale? Because there seems to be a lot of potential for this president and those in his orbit to boost their own bottom lines while he's in office. And that is especially true for the people closest to him, his immediate family. His wife, First Lady Melania Trump, launched her own cryptocurrency token just days before the inauguration. His son, Don Jr., is now part of a venture capital fund, while his other son, Eric Trump, heads up the Trump Organization. And despite removing himself from the West Wing this time around, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, founded a private equity firm that does a whole lot of business with foreign governments, and he's also in partnership with the Trump Organization. But I want to take a closer look at the patriarch and some of his more recent business ventures. He's been making announcements on his social media platform, Truth Social, part of his media company, and by the way, he's the majority owner of it. He also has his own crypto exchange, World Liberty Financial, and just ahead of his swearing in, he released his own meme coin that is now worth tens of billions of dollars. I want to discuss it with Tim O'Brien, Bloomberg Opinion Senior Executive Editor and Trump biographer. Okay, Tim. It is no surprise that Donald Trump wants to make money. People many people aren't happy with it, but it's a foregone conclusion. But I want to talk about crypto. And I know lots of people don't like it, don't want to hear about it. But shouldn't we care about the fact that people could be buying up his coin because they want stuff? They want favors from our government, favors that are not in our national interest. They pay Trump personally. They get things from our government.
You know, Stephanie, I wouldn't describe it as Donald Trump likes to make money. I would say that Donald Trump likes to grift. And this is a classic example of it. You know, a meme coin is a collector's item. It's not fiat currency. It really has no value other than the fact that someone's name is attached to it. And if you get enough interest in it and it begins trading, other people buy it, and then presto. In Trump's case, it's worth billions of dollars. And as you correctly noted, it makes our national security and our national interest vulnerable because it's very easy for outside entities to join the party and essentially capture both Trump's attention and his wallet by bidding up the Trump meme coins. The other dimension of this that is out of the box, both bonkers and unacceptable, is that one of the driving forces right now in driving crypto prices higher is the fact that Trump's federal government has talked about making crypto a storehouse of value and will be held as an asset by the Treasury Department.
Okay, so hold on a minute. Hold on a minute, because you lose people when we often lose people when we get to that point. So I want to just explain it a little bit slower, because by Trump even putting forward the idea, which he did today, he signed an executive order that he wants to evaluate the potential for a national digital asset stockpile. Again, people are tuning out saying, what does that mean? But don't we need to care about that? Because if they go through with that, that means if crypto blows up, the U.S. government could end up having another bailout for the crypto industry, one that taxpayers are going to be on the hook for. Isn't that why we need to care?
I think that's an important part of why we need to care. Hopefully, the banks and the federal government won't bring so much crypto into their coffers that it becomes a systemic problem. But let's take the word crypto out of it to make the issues here. You've isolated this in a really useful way. Donald Trump owns a platform that trades this stuff. Let's call it, he has an investment in a platform that trades this stuff. He has an investment in the asset that's traded on that platform. And he's putting the faith of the federal government behind part of the industry. Every part of this, he benefits financially from any increase in the price. And meanwhile, he becomes a target for foreign interests who want to get his attention or his loyalty. And he did this in many ways during his first term. Remember, there was the Trump Hotel in Washington.
But this is so much bigger.
But this is so much bigger. And the dollar amounts are far larger. And the issues that were present in Trump 1.0, that there aren't any real restraints ethically or legally around a president self-dealing and conducting business in the Oval Office, has been now compounded by the Supreme Court saying the president is also immune from criminal acts. And
All right,
Trump
well, what's your
reads
take
all
on
that.
this one? Okay, it is day 4. Donald Trump is making his calls to other world leaders. Think about all of the major countries around the world, people who he would want to speak to. And one of the very first phone calls he makes is to the president of teeny tiny El Salvador, which people might not realize is the first country to use Bitcoin as legal tender. And of course, soon after that call was announced, Bitcoin surged. What do you think about that? El Salvador, of all the countries in the world.
And the White House readout of the call mentioned nothing about the fact that they might have discussed crypto. It talked about immigration, Latin American affairs, and everything else. I don't think Donald Trump, on day 4 of his second term, is calling the leader of a small Central American government because he cares about immigration or any other issue other than the fact that they are a player in the crypto world, and he knows he's adding legitimacy to that by calling them, and he stands to gain financially from it. And until the White House becomes clearer about the content of that call and Trump's intentions behind it, we're just left to suspect that that might be the underlying reason.
I can't even believe I'm asking you this question, but here we go, because you mentioned Trump's first term. Today, the White House announced that Donald Trump plans to spend most weekends at his house in Florida, Mar-a-Lago. He likes to call it the Winter White House. It is not. It's his private home, but it's also a club. During his first administration, all sorts of watchdog groups highlighted the millions and millions of dollars he made from foreign patronage to his hotels, all the people who went to Mar-a-Lago, all the money the U.S. government had to pay because he was overcharging to have the Secret Service and his staff all stay there. Are we just going to get that this time around, but supercharged? Since he didn't get in trouble for it last time, he's figured out how to double down and charge even more.
Yeah, of course, I think that's going to happen. The other thing is if he's conducting official business at Mar-a-Lago and you have none of the record keeping or cataloging that you would have at the White House in terms of who he's meeting with and who he's visiting with, it introduces another level of opacity into Trump's dealings as president. And the more time he's conducting public business from there rather than from the White House, people should be concerned about what he's doing in the dark.